On the snowy platform, he said, "You're older than he thought." No welcome, no explanation, just silence and a few cold dollars. But what happened next will change everything. First, let's go back to the beginning. The wind at sundown came low and deliberate, brushing past the cracked wood of the platform like it, too, wanted nothing to do with her. Grace Whitmore didn't flinch. She had faced colder things than weather. The hem of her burgundy dress, once her Sunday best, now darkened at the edges from snowmelt and dirt, whispered across her boots as she shifted her weight. It was the only sound besides the wheeze of the departing locomotive and the slow creak of the sign that read, Jackson Hollow, a name as forgotten as she felt. She stood very still, her spine straight in a way that was neither proud nor defiant, but simply practiced. A woman who had learned, over time, that if you didn't carry yourself with dignity, no one else would lend it to you. The leather suitcase in her hand, not new, not polished, contained everything she now owned. 3 dresses, 2 books, a hairbrush, and a locket she hadn't opened in 15 years. What she had left behind was greater: a cottage, her late sister's piano, and a life spent believing that the best parts of love belonged only to the young. Thomas Callahan had seemed like a kind man. His letters were plain, his handwriting blocky and misspelled, but there was gentleness in the phrasing. "I don't want much, just company and someone to talk to when the nights get cold." That had been enough. Enough to make her sell her linens and pack her grief. Enough to tell herself that perhaps she hadn't missed the train on happiness after all. But when the man arrived, not Thomas, but some hired boy with muddy boots and a look that wouldn't meet her eyes, the words he offered her cut as cleanly as a butcher's knife. "You're older than he thought." She'd almost laughed, as if that were news. Instead, she gave a single nod, neither humble nor bitter, only final. Time had carved lines into her skin, but it had also taught her that heartbreak didn't always come in shouts. Sometimes, it came in a single sentence, spoken by someone who didn't even care enough to say it gently. 2 hours later, when the same boy returned and handed her a few dollars and no apology, Grace took the money like it was a glass of cold water handed to a drowning woman. Then she turned, walked off the platform, and disappeared down the road with the snow following in silence, as if the world itself had nothing left to offer but witness. The room above the general store was neither warm nor cold. It simply existed, like a place that made no promises. The floor groaned beneath every step Grace took, and the thin walls held the murmurs of passing weather and muffled voices from below. The window overlooked the main road, though the view was modest. A dusty track, the post office, a mercantile with flaking paint, and the church bell that tolled once a week for memory's sake more than God's glory. The only light came from an oil lamp that flickered like it might go out just to spare itself the burden of watching another day end. Grace hung her dress carefully each evening, smoothing the velvet down with her hands like she was calming a child. It had grown heavier since she arrived, not in weight but in meaning. No one called her Grace anymore. She was the lady in the velvet dress, spoken with a mix of pity and distance, like a story you tell to feel better about your own. "She came for a man," they whispered, and all she got was silence. But Grace didn't bruise easily. She had known the cold weight of long pauses at supper tables, the ache of letters that stopped arriving, and the sound of her own heartbeat in the middle of a prayer. She filled her days with work that gave no applause, fixing sleeves, hemming petticoats, baking pies whose crusts flaked like old memories. She never tasted them. They were traded away. A cherry pie for a bundle of kindling, a peach tart for a tin of lye soap. Each trade was quiet, discreet, and distant. People admired her pies, but never invited her in. Grace didn't mind. She understood boundaries, hers and theirs. At dusk, she set the table for two. One cup of tea sat before her, steaming softly. The other, untouched, faced the empty chair across from her. A ritual, not of grief, but of remembering. She never explained it. She didn't need to. Those who had ever been left behind without ceremony understood. They recognized the reverence in her routine, the gentle placing of china, the silence that filled the space where love once promised to sit. Eli Morgan saw her first through the store window. Not just her shape, but her stillness. He didn't look for conversation, but he watched the way she sewed at the bench near the door, each stitch precise, as if she were mending time. Her hands were steady, her eyes downcast but never dim. When he spoke, it was not flirtation, only truth. "You sew like you're telling a story." And when she lifted her face, she didn't blush. She smiled like someone who had learned to live with silence and fill it with meaning. "That's because I am," she said. The first book arrived with no note, just leaves of grass, left squarely on the wooden step outside her door, its pages worn at the edges like a man's hands. Grace stared at it for a moment before picking it up, as if uncertain whether it was truly meant for her. But there was no mistaking the intention. The only person who passed her door without rushing was Eli Morgan, and his silence, she'd learned, was not absence. It was presence without pressure. She read the book slowly, savoring its wildness and wounds, and 2 days later, placed a still warm slice of apple pie in its place, beside a folded scrap of stationery. This one tasted like your silence. It became their rhythm. Books for pies, poems for pastries. She read Self-Reliance and returned a peach tart with the line, "This one made me think of your stubbornness." He left the red badge of courage, and she responded with a blackberry cobbler and a note that read, "Courage doesn't always shout." No one else in town noticed the ritual. Or maybe they did, and politely looked away, the way people sometimes do when something is too quiet and too beautiful to disturb. They never spoke of the reasons that had carved them hollow. No talk of Eli's long widowhood or Grace's walk from the train platform with dignity clenched in both hands. Yet something in their silences grew familiar, like rain on the same roof over many nights. It was a Thursday evening when Eli finally asked, without looking directly at her, "Were you waiting for someone on that train?" She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers were curled around a cup of tea, and her eyes had found the horizon like it held the answer she'd once expected. "I thought I was," she said at last. "But maybe I was just getting off where I was meant to stay." They were sitting on his porch that night. 2 chairs, no urgency. The sun had fallen behind the hills, and the air was the kind that held its breath between seasons. They spoke of the cattle he couldn't quite keep corralled, of the way early snow muffled even the sharpest sound. It wasn't conversation. It was companionship, dressed in small talk. When she stood to leave, he reached inside and returned with a shawl. Pale wool, worn soft. "It was hers," he said, without apology. Grace took it in her hands but didn't put it on. "I'm not replacing her," she said gently. He nodded once, solemn. "No. You're reminding me what it feels like to have someone to talk to." And just like that, the porch became something sacred. A place where 2 souls didn't need to be fixed, only acknowledged. The spring festival returned like an old friend remembered too late. Shy at first, then blooming in full. Bunting in faded reds and soft yellows hung across Main Street like threads of warmth, stitched into the chill that still lingered. Children chased ribbons, dogs barked at fiddles, and the scent of cinnamon and earth floated on the air. It was a gathering not of spectacle, but of ritual. The town reminding itself that joy still fit, even if it wore new wrinkles. Grace stood by the church steps as laughter laced the air, her hands smoothing the skirt of the pale blue dress she'd made over winter. It wasn't youthful, but it was hopeful. Carefully stitched, soft at the collar, a small fabric flower blooming just above her heart. The color made her eyes look like early morning. Eli found her there, not with flourish but quiet certainty, his arm offered without expectation. He wore a coat that had seen better years and a clean shirt that smelled faintly of pine soap. When she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, it was not an act of surrender but of decision. Some folks noticed. A few smiled, others nodded, and more than one woman pressed a hand to her chest with a private, unspoken ache, as if remembering a time they too had hoped late. Under lanterns strung between sycamores, they stood at the edge of the dance circle. The fiddler raised his bow and laughter spun like wind through branches. Eli turned to her, one brow slightly raised. "Can I claim this as my first dance in a decade?" She looked away, not in shyness, but in search of the right words. "I'm not young." He leaned just enough to meet her gaze. "You're not a girl," he said. "You're a woman. There's a world of difference." So they danced. Not to dazzle, but to remember. Her hand in his, her steps unsure at first, then steady as the music folded them into something almost sacred. They moved like people not showing, but belonging. Eyes met, not to measure, but to witness. For a single, unguarded moment, two lives tangled by time stood whole. 1 week later, at a wooden table set for two, Eli buttered toast without ceremony. He looked up only once, but that was enough. "Let's not waste another season alone," he said. There was no ring, no kneeling, no theater. Just a truth, offered plainly, like a hand extended in a storm. Grace smiled, not like a woman receiving a proposal, but like one finally being answered.